The trout in Britain's northern rivers is very different from the trout of the gentle streams of the south. The difference expresses the differences of the streams themselves. In the north, the water is fast-flowing over rocky, rugged beds. Because there's less weed than in the softer chalk streams of the south, there's less creature life bred in these waters for the trout to live on. Life for the trout here is not as rich, not as soft. So the trout are smaller, harder-looking, leaner. This trout, the brown trout, is common to all Britain, but this particular brown trout comes from the northern waters. The chalk stream trout can afford to look closely at the fly before it takes it, but not so the rocky river trout. There the flies don't hatch with the same regularity as they do in the southern streams, and when they do come, they're generally sparser, so the trout has to grab the food while it's there. So different artificial flies are used. This typical chalk stream fly, neatly tied, imitates a fairly close look at the insect it represents. But this Yorkshire fly doesn't attempt close imitation. It's sparsely tied with soft, straggly hackles. The play of water on the mobile hackles just under the surface conveys an impression of life which attracts. Unlike dry fly fishing, in which only one fly is used, in wet fly you use several, usually three. There's one at the point of the cast, and the others are spaced at yard intervals up the cast on dropper links like this. The bottom one is known as the point fly. The next one is known as the first dropper, and the second dropper above. Now, where should we go for wet fly fishing for trout? Let's go to the Wharfe in Yorkshire. This river is very typical of its kind. It rises in the limestone of the Pennines and runs easterly through rugged country, descending very steeply. Streamy runs, fast-running shallow stickles, sometimes gliding pools. We're going to be with Hebert Normington today. He's an expert with the Upstream wet fly, a traditional art in Yorkshire and the northern counties, and one at which Hebert Normington is very experienced. It's by no means perfect weather for the wet fly. There's quite a breeze, and clouds are causing frequent changes of light as they pass across the sun. Hebert chooses 3 flies to allow for various contingencies of the most likely ones to hatch. For the tail fly, a little dark watchet. A snipe and yellow for the first dropper, a very typical Yorkshire fly that. And on the top dropper, a Greenwell's Glory, another very typical Yorkshire fly, which imitates various of the olives. The tackle he's using is the same as for the dry fly, the rod 8 to 9 feet, with a tapered line and a cast of probably 9 feet. This is thin and difficult water to fish. He wades gently in, because disturbances are very easily carried to the trout in very shallow water. With upstream wet fly fishing, you go for those fish that are feeding close to the surface. He's moving carefully upstream to cast ahead of him over the fish as they face into the current. Short, quick casts, not more than twice the length of the rod. He lifts his rod at just such a rate that the flies come at the same pace, or very slightly more than the pace of the current, looking all the time for signs where trout are likely to be. If he sees a trout rise, of course, he'll cast over it. But most of this kind of fishing is prospecting, based on judgment and experience, and knowledge of where fish could be. see how the flies behave. They come down just under the surface, the mobile, flexible hackles worked upon by the current, and they move, suggesting life, suggesting the nymph struggling to become a fly. As the flies come back, he raises his rod so as to keep contact with the flies, but not to drag them. It's easier for a fish to hook himself that way. Remember, these are hungry, rough river trout. They have to take their food when it comes. They can't afford to wait to examine an insect closely. That's why these flies suggest action, movement, rather than close resemblance. Now, there should be a fish in that rather smooth stream, smooth compared with the rest of this rough water. Just below those rocks, there in all those little pockets of current, there should be a trout, there must be a trout, and it must be kept in a constant state of expectancy. This is the precise and delicate art of the upstream wet fly, based upon judgment of water, based upon where the fish should be by reading the water. Of course, if there's a rise, it makes the fisherman's life easier. It means that nymphs are rising to the surface. And when the trout sees the nymphs, he goes to take them just as they hatch at the surface. Then there's something more definite to go on. Hebert can cast where he sees the fish actually taking the hatching nymphs, and that's what's happening now. Herbert's casting at rises to tempt the trout to take his fly, a mistake for the real one. There it is. There it is. Yes, it's on. He's hooked it. And there's the fish fighting hard as all these northern fish do. These rocky river fish are so much better fighters than their south country brothers. Gaining line a little, but get ready to give when it runs. Like that. These rough river trout never give up. And although they're not as heavy, they use the fast water, and to hook them is not necessary to land them. The fish is tiring a little now. Herbert's bringing it in, but there's still lots of life left. Net? No, not yet. Now, gently in and over with the fish so that it's safely netted. And there it is, a beautiful limestone river trout. There are few sights on earth like these trout, freshly from the river, yellow as a buttercup round the gills, round their flanks. Beautiful little wild fish. In this sort of river, where you've taken one fish, you can expect more. And if you don't disturb the water, you can work upstream, taking a fish here and a fish there, in every little pocket of current. And that's what Hebert Normington is going to do on this spring day as we leave him. That was a lovely day's fishing. Whichever way you fish for trout, it's beautiful fishing. Now, I have with me Dick Bartholomew, who's a dry fly fisherman and was born and bred on the South Country chalk stream. Now, I suppose there's no one more convinced of the superiority of the dry fly over the wet than a dry fly fisherman of the chalk streams. Now, Dick, do you believe that the dry fly is superior in skill to the wet fly?
Bernard, I have no hesitation at all in saying that I think there's just no comparison. The dry fly fisherman has to find his fish, his individual fish, and stalk that fish. He then has to cast his fly within inches and also with a gossamer lightness.
But, Dick, won't you allow that wet fly fishing has its skills too?
Ah, yes, it has its skills, no doubt. But what does the wet fly fisherman do? He casts his fly somewhere in the water, and then he hopes to God that there's a fish there that's going to take it.
I'll take you up on that, Dick. Now, to be a successful wet fly fisherman, you've got to have a deep knowledge of the water. You've got to be able to read the water. And you've got to be able to judge where fish will be.
Ah, yes, but Bernard, that's not so much the actual technique of the fisherman. That is the technique of a naturalist.
Yes, indeed it is. And that, it seems to me, is something in favour of the wet fly fisherman. He has to be something more than just a manipulator of tackle. In a sense, he too fishes to an individual fish. But unlike the dry fly fisherman, he doesn't have the help of seeing the rise or seeing the fish. He has to rely upon his accumulated knowledge to know where the fish is. And that surely demands at least as much skill as that of the dry fly.
Well, Bernard, I can't agree with you, and I don't suppose I ever shall. It seems to me that the wet fly fisherman relies far too much on the old chuck it and chance it technique, and that I can't agree with, and I don't think I ever shall.
Well, there's the typical attitude of the really dedicated dry fly fisherman. And this argument between the dry fly and the wet fly will continue as long as there is fly fishing. And indeed, all the arguments of fishing will go on endlessly without ever being resolved. And I, for one, am glad, because there's so much of the fun of fishing in these arguments. Well, let's go fishing together soon. Goodbye for now.